supermarket, apparel, sector in the UK. So the first thing is it's pretty sizable. It's 4.5 billion in terms of sales from the traditional four big supermarkets who've all got a clothing offer. And that 4.5 billion is roughly representative around 7-8% of the overall UK market.
Dean, thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table. You always have incredibly interesting insights to share. And today we're going to be diving into supermarket fashion in the UK, which is, I think, particularly interesting because the fashion industry has been struggling a bit, particularly at a more mass market level, right? Because people are saying, well, we have all these rock bottom e-commerce players coming in and we can barely survive in the face of that. And yet supermarkets seem to have carved out their own niche. So perhaps you could explain a little bit what you're seeing on your side.
Of course, Jane, and I think my overall description would be that there's been quite a bit of change in this market, and I think, in fairness, there's going to be more change to come, and we're seeing some of that play out. But maybe just helpful for the listeners, just to give a bit of context around the supermarket, apparel, fashion sector in the UK. So the first thing is it's pretty sizable. So it's 4.5 billion in terms of sales from the traditional four big supermarkets who've all got a clothing offer. And that 4.5 billion is roughly representative around 7-8% of the overall UK market. So again, quite a big number. And to put that into further context, if you added up all the supermarket fashion sales together, they would equal the number one player in the UK, because I think Next is around about 7-8% in terms of market share. So considerable and pretty established, actually. So most of the operators have been operating now for 20 to 30 years. So, well represented and well understood and regarded by the customers. And in terms of the operations, there's a physical element in terms of trade coming through the stores, but also some of the retailers do have an e-commerce online platform. And maybe to play to your position at the start as well, I mean, if you look in terms of recent years, there has actually been a drop in total market share for the sector, which is quite interesting, actually. So if you go back to 2021, the supermarket clothing sector had run about 8.5% in terms of apparel sales. And obviously, that's now dropped to, as I say, around about 7%. In fact, I think 6.7% is the total number. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. Some of them I would almost describe as a consequence of the market and external dynamics, such as things like the cost of living crisis that's existed certainly in the UK and obviously globally as well, where customers have knowingly been quite constrained in terms of their shopping patterns when they visit the big supermarket, and tried to stay out of the non-food and clothing aisles, so they're not increasing their overall basket spend. So that's kind of a consequence in terms of economically, but also some of that is definitely driven by the supermarkets themselves in terms of their strategic approach, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, in terms of they've almost knowingly kind of held back in terms of their further growth and development of the non-food and clothing businesses in the supermarkets, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But the summary is it's quite a sizable market, and has gone through quite a bit of change, and there is more change to come.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I really wasn't aware that it was that big a share of the total market. I mean, that's quite an achievement when you think about it. I mean, considering all the different competitors, to be able to have achieved that level of market share is pretty interesting. When you look at it, what's giving them their strategic advantage, so to speak? There's e-commerce, you have your regular high street brands, you have the various brands like Shein and other online brands, for example. How are supermarkets winning? I mean, they're up against a lot of competition.
Yeah, and maybe to this point, actually, again, might be helpful in terms of further context for the listeners, just to kind of describe a little bit in terms of the journey, because I've alluded to the fact that there's been change that's happened and a change in focus. So if you look at what's happened in the supermarkets, and I'm sure this echoed in part in the States and other countries around the world. But if you look at the history of supermarket apparel and fashion, if you go back to the 90s, so 90s and early 2000s was really all around growth. And this was tied in with the growth of the supermarket sector as a whole. So there was almost, we called it the space race, that everyone was trying to increase space in terms of do more supermarkets, do bigger supermarkets, build extensions, build mezzanines, etc. And there was an element of the non-food was an important part of that, because that was required to fill this additional space. So it was like more space, bigger stores, and the expansion of non-food. And non-food really, if you go back to that timeline, was really seen as a footfall driver. So, an opportunity to basically increase basket spend and draw more people into the stores. Then the first big change happened in 2014. So not too long ago, actually, but 2014. And the space race pretty much overnight in the UK ended. And there was an acknowledgement that all the supermarkets didn't want to open any more new stores. The stores were big enough. And that was mainly driven by an acknowledgement that discounters were here to stay in terms of Aldi and Lidl in the UK, and also around some of the shopping patterns that were happening in the UK. The drive for convenience, people didn't want to shop huge stores anymore. They wanted a more localized shop. And also in terms of the kind of growth of e-commerce and online. So they were two factors as well. So 2014, all that space stopped. And then one further, and probably the most interesting dynamic in the UK, one further change happened, which was around about 2018 through to really 2020, 2021, so more recent years, where the big supermarkets adopted a food-first agenda. So this was all about now, no more additional space, take the fight to the discounters, Aldi and Lidl, but concentrate on the core business, their main purpose, which was really around food itself. And what that meant for the last few years, up until very recently, that non-food has really not been on the agenda to the extent where it was, and not seen as important, albeit as a scalable number, as we talked about before. And that's quite interesting, actually. Just one further example in terms of that timeline. In 2018, as part of those changes in that food-first agenda, Tesco actually closed down a .com business for non-food. They had a significant business, Tesco Direct, and they said, we're shutting it. We're only going to operate sales of non-food, general merchandise and clothing through our stores. So I think the context is quite important. Yeah. But we're now entering a period the historical context is quite important, but we're now entering a period of stability going into future growth opportunities. But at the same time, the profitability is really, really important. So because of that food first agenda, what it really means is that the non-food operations, clothing, for instance, has to stand on its own feet. So it has to be profitable, and it has to be a supporter of the food business. So that core focus of food first, really, really important in the UK. And therefore, non-food is basically an enabler and a supporter at an incremental profitability to the business that ultimately enables the food retailer to then be more competitive, invest in price, and continue to challenge and hold their position against the discounters. So I'll just pause there for a moment.
I think that's really interesting, because you're right, that is a very different model than what a typical apparel retailer or even a discounter that's carrying more than just apparel would be facing. So that's an interesting dimension to it. I think that it's interesting that they not only brought in fashion, right, or apparel, you might say, into the stores, but they seem to be really taking it quite deep in terms of a fashion kind of an offering. Normally you would think it would be more basics, but actually from what we can see, they've invested in really bringing a fashion story through, and also in quality.
Absolutely. And, that's been one of the big changes, because again, if you go back to the early days of where the business was starting to develop, it really, to your point, it was all about essentials, basic essentials, women's leggings, underwear, men's PK polo shirts, etc. It was really basic stuff. Then as the brands began to establish in terms of credibility there was the move into a more fashionability and ensuring that customers were really being engaged and motivated to purchase accordingly. So that is definitely one of the big changes. But of course, actually, if you take it from a supermarket perspective, it really all comes down to space. Against that food first, in terms of they are grocers. So, as the Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrisons, they first and foremost grocers. So it's about how do you understand in terms of how much space do you give to non-food and fashion. My summation around that would be that there's a lot more science now in terms of data and insight that's been used to understand that. Because again, in the early days, it really was as simplistic as too much space overall. Let's tighten up our food ranges, increase trade intensity, therefore on food, and give space to non-food. Even to the extent of sometimes it wasn't, going back to that essentials versus fashionability, the ranges weren't even in existence to give that additional space to. But now really it's all about really lasering in and understanding in terms of the amount of space that is required in each supermarket. And a number of the supermarkets are really doing some really great work around that. And that's really understanding first and foremost around shopping missions. Mm-hmm. And whereas before it was a very generic, so maybe a supermarket that's got 500-600 stores and they're all treated, more or less the same. Whereas we know that different supermarkets in different locations operate in different ways. So understanding what the mission of the customer is in terms of, is it a convenience mission where somebody's just coming in to buy some basic foods for, say, tonight or tomorrow? Is it more of a mid-town, medium-sized shop? Or is it a true destination store in terms of where you're pulling from much wider catchment? And now there is a lot more science, even down to using things like machine learning, AI, etc., to understand in terms of what the ranges should be in that particular store. So obviously, a convenience range will be, or a convenience food store will attribute in terms of more of a convenience-orientated non-food offer, and possibly more essentials as opposed to the destination supermarkets in terms of where you have got much more space to really show the offer in its entirety.
That makes a lot of sense. Where do you think supermarkets might be going with their fashion ranges? I mean, do you feel that this is a growth category, that this is something they're going to look to as something that will bring more profitability as well as bring people in? Or is this just going to simply be sort of a sideline?
No, I think it's definitely an opportunity for growth, and we're seeing that in the UK. So against that context of a slight contraction, a reduction in focus to now then into a stable position, we're now into a situation where non-food is now back on the agenda. Still against food first is still a priority, but non-food's back on the agenda. And there is some really interesting things that are happening out there. So if maybe I share a few of those, Jane. So I think the first one around branded partners. Not unusual, and a lot of the high street retailers, particularly with big online platforms, Next, M&S are doing the same, but it's been relatively new for supermarkets. So bringing in branded partners, both in terms of the stores, but obviously that was going to be in the bigger departments, so again, the destination supermarkets, but particularly on the online platform. So if I give you a couple of examples, so I've got a company called G21, which is a ladies' fashion brand. They've also got a brand called Gym Locker, which obviously specialises in gym wear. Sainsbury's, through their Two Clothing brand, are probably the most dynamic in this place, actually. I had tried to add up on the website, actually. I think they must have about 40, 50 different brands that they're now retailing on their website or on online platform. Some of them are really interesting, actually, and some of them are really well known, such as brands like Fat Face, Hush Puppies in terms of a footwear brand, French Connection, etc. But also some really new up-and-coming brands. So again, if you take the Sainsbury's example, a ladies' fashion brand called JJ Rebel, another one called Noisy May, not well-recognised brands in the UK. So it's a real mix in terms of complementary around really well-established retail brands that then sit alongside your supermarket clothing brand, but also the introduction of something new, something that maybe the customer's not heard of, and again using that platform. So that's really been one of the interesting developments. But I should say, actually, just for the listeners' awareness, actually, not all the supermarkets do have an online platform. So as I've already mentioned, Tesco doesn't. They just concentrate all their efforts in terms of the physical retailing across about 600 stores. Morrison's only have a very small representation. So the two big ones really are Asda and Sainsbury's. So brand partners, I think, is only going to grow. And brand partners is quite interesting in terms of why they're doing it, actually. There's definitely the opportunity in part around enhancing the credibility of your own brand. So you've got a number of brands that sit alongside. But also what's quite interesting, and certainly when you speak to some of the senior exec in these organisations, I think there's a real understanding here about the importance of you place the brand, and obviously customers will see their price position and actually the supermarket's own brand value message, because customers can make a comparison. And the final point, which we know very well in terms of how all the websites and social media operate, is people love to browse. And I think, but in order to browse, you need content, and giving customers lots of content and the opportunity to review different brands and different names is a good thing. And then the second one I would say in terms of fashionability and development is around celebrity collaborations. So this is where the supermarket brand is still an own brand, but they'll literally tie up with a celebrity. And that really gives the added interest to the customer, the added engagement factor there, but also is pretty profitable in terms of there's a cost associated with taking the celebrity on board. But at the same time, it's high margin and also it's fast turnover. So there are kind of couple elements that I think are interesting to watch.
I think that's really interesting. And I hadn't actually realized that these supermarkets were, in a sense, creating these third-party marketplaces around what they were doing themselves with their own collections. I think that's really interesting. That's, in a sense, you could say maybe they're going head-to-head with an Amazon or somebody like that, right? In terms
Absolutely.
Yeah,
we know, for instance, that Amazon obviously is the expert at this in terms of being able to have a model that you can operate in terms of a number of brands through. I think going back to that point about the importance of profitability, this also has a really important aspect in terms of the opportunity to sell product using another brand, but at the same time, you're not tying up in terms of cash flow, in terms of stock, etc. And I think, again, going back to the point I've said a few times now, that first and foremost, the fashion element and the apparel within a supermarket has to be profitable, and therefore the operation has to be efficient. So therefore, where the fulfillment is being driven in terms of supply direct fulfillment is being driven, again, that can only help in terms of profitability.
absolutely. And for the brands that are coming on as partner brands, it's giving them fantastic exposure, not only to a very, very wide audience, but also people are automatically, like you say, a lot of the problems online is customer acquisition, right? CAC is so expensive these days, and people are naturally going to be shopping in a supermarket. It's one of the few things that you absolutely have to do on a very regular basis. So to be able to have your products in a place that's automatically going to have very high traffic has got to be a tremendous win.
Absolutely. And to the point, actually, grocery retailing is pretty, I'm going to use a word maybe being slightly unfair, a little bit mundane, the kind of the ranges. And don't get me wrong, in the UK, a lot has been done in terms of own brand development, right the way through from more sustainable organics, etc., better quality. So some interesting things, but actually fundamentally the food shop is the food shop. So I think the challenge for the supermarkets is how do you position something that is different, a different experience for your customers? And this is even more important against the dynamics that exist in the UK and other countries, where the biggest threat is the discounter. So it's the likes of Aldi and Lidl. And we know that Aldi and Lidl, their operating model is great. Sidetracking slightly onto food, they have 2,500 food lines. Big supermarket might have 40,000 food lines. Yeah. So what you're trying to show, though, is you're trying to show points of difference other than just the dynamic of price and value. So whether that be newness and something different in food, but also this is where I think non-food has a really exciting opportunity around for customers to see different things. And again, in terms of some of those collaborations we talked about, some of those new retail brands the opportunity for change and bringing packages in, whether it be online or in store, turning that at a slightly faster rate, I think adds to that level of interest and a point of difference versus the discounters.
I think that's really true. And certainly what we're seeing in certain supermarkets, not every single one of them, but we are seeing in more supermarkets, they're trying to create these little areas in within the store to create a mood, particularly around holiday time, or sometimes during other seasonal displays where they bring together, they'll create a table setting, for example. And so they'll show all the different foods on the table and they'll make it look really nice and they'll show glassware and linens and then perhaps some other things around it just to try to get you in the mood as a shopper. So I think apparel can play quite well into that.
Absolutely. And I'm really pleased you mentioned that around the seasonal element because it is really important. So if you take the bigger displays, obviously goes back to that point about where you've got the bigger supermarkets with maybe some of spare square footage, and you then can create that destination footprint within the store that's just for non-food. So that goes without saying, and you can maybe operate that all year round. But where the UK supermarkets, and I would say particularly led by Asda, I think Asda were doing some really great stuff, and it was even further enhanced when they were part of Walmart. I think creating that destination feel-good seasonal area, to your point, they do that really well. And they do that at seasonal times, whether it be Easter, whether it be Christmas, etc., Valentine's, Mother's Day, all the big calendar events through the UK. I think non-food has its part to play. I mean, probably the best one that really stands out is Halloween. Obviously, it's a growth area within the UK and in the States. Obviously, that's been big for many, many years. But that real theatre opportunity for, again, engaging the customers and trying to link in as well and enhance the overall food offer is important. Probably worth touching, actually, one area which tied in with that seasonal calendar, but also around the supermarkets have really carved out almost a bit of a niche for themselves in terms of being seen as, I'd almost describe as a consumer champion, would be back to school. So back to college, back to school. So the selling of the provision of schoolwear, which is sold all year round, but actually, particularly when you get to the likes of September, when the kids are going back to colleges and schools, the supermarkets have really driven a really established profile and a market share position that is significantly ahead of where their overall market share position would be. And again, they've used, to the point we mentioned, in terms of creating event space and really being seen by the customer in terms of having huge aisles that will be full of schoolwear in terms of apparel and also things like stationery, etc., and being seen as a champion. So they have the best, keenest price position on things like any of the aspects of school uniform, which really plays to at a time where the UK consumer actually is, still the inflation's come down, but it's still under some pressure. And I think what we're seeing is that feel-good factor and that loyalty factor of seeing good value clothing at a good price that further locks in the loyalty to the supermarket brand.
I think that's a really good point. And I think, as you're saying, when you create that destination, people want to go there, right? There's a curiosity, there's an excitement. And while they're in there, you end up buying stuff simply because the price isn't as good as it may be at some other place, but the ticket isn't so big and it's not really worth going elsewhere. So you think, oh, I'm here anyway. I need bread. Well, okay, their bread is a little more expensive, or their butter's a little more expensive, or their vegetables are more expensive. But oh, well, okay, this one time. So I think that there's a lot of residual value that comes through all of that. We've sort of lost that, I think, in the day and age where everything's been focused on discounting and price. And we've lost some of that magic that visual merchandising brings and how that, in a sense, drives sales.
Absolutely. And what I would say is that, in terms of the supermarket environment, and again, against this position of being efficient and profitable, I don't think we'll ever truly, outside of maybe the 5% of a chain's true big destination stores, I don't think we'll ever truly see areas that, from a merchandising, display, equipment, lighting, that are super enhanced, because, that's not the model. I don't think we're going to see that. But again, playing to the point around certain times of year where you can really take that opportunity in terms of to create that theatre is definitely a big tick.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that where you have tremendous expertise is in supply chain. And I think that this particular model is interesting because, especially nowadays, we thought, in a sense, that 2024 was going to be the year everything got back to normal. And that didn't seem to happen. And then, everyone thought, well, it's going to be 20. And now, from the looks of things, it isn't going to be 2025 unless a lot changes really fast. How do you see all of this tying in with the supermarket model, which is a pretty fast turn kind of a model?
I think it's a really good question, and definitely one worth spending a few minutes on. So it absolutely, in terms of supply chain efficiency and overall operational efficiency, it absolutely plays to the point that the supermarkets, in terms of their fashion businesses, need to have a model that is profitable, as we said a number of times, that is efficient and has been good at taking cost out. And maybe if I touch on three or four areas here. So the first one is, even before the supply chain element, there's something around operational simplicity. So how simple is it? How simple is it to operate those ranges within the supermarket? So reducing touch points, getting a very efficient stock flow so that the colleagues in the supermarkets don't have to double handle product. It comes in through the back door. It's in the right quantities. It's on hangers. They don't have to do lots and lots of tasks. And basically it goes on sale and it sells, or it's reduced and then it sells. It's in, it's out. So that operational element in terms of cost is really, really important in terms of the model. Then it's really around, this is where it does get quite interesting actually. Then it's really around taking every opportunity to remove complexity and take cost out. So this is where we've definitely seen developments in terms of linking in with trusted partners. This kind of goes to the point again around brands. So where you've got product lines that are maybe a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult to manage. A good example I always use is footwear. It's harder to do. So therefore, rather than try and develop it yourself, but bringing in a trusted partner who's well known into, say, a footwear brand, and then you sell their products in terms of either through your stores or on your website. And then on the outsourcing of supply chain tasks, we've touched on this on previous calls, Jane. So this is really around the continuation of trying to take tasks out. And I've gone on record a few times as saying that a lot of retailers have done a very, very good job here. But equally, there are a lot of retailers who've been, in my personal view, maybe quite slow and are probably still talking about the same things that they were talking about 5 years ago. So whether that be about design development cycles, whether it be the sign off of product from a technical perspective, and where that task sits is really important to actually try and reduce the cost in terms of that exists within your own organization. And then the operating model. I think this is really, really interesting, actually. So, and again, tying into the supermarket piece. So what we've seen, and probably the retailer that's done the most here in terms of supermarket brand retailer, is Asda. So obviously Asda was sold, Walmart sold Asda a few years ago. They kind of then came away from the whole Walmart infrastructure, and they basically outsourced to PDS the whole of their sourcing model. So all their sourcing staff all went across to PDS, and the whole operation is now run by PDS. So that's kind of taking it to an extreme. But I would see further evolution in that area in terms of not just about the handing over of physical task and process, to one where retailers are saying, actually, do we need to do it? Do we need to do this ourselves? Or can we have a trusted partner, i.e. the equivalent of a PDS, who's going to be able to manage the whole thing for us? And then really, it's almost like an account management piece. All you've really got in terms of investment around your own resource, it's really just around supplier relationship management in terms of SRM, in terms of you're managing that supplier to do a great job for you. So I think maintaining operational simplicity in terms of the store operations, taking every opportunity to not building complexity. So if there's something that's complex, get somebody else to do it for you. Continuation around the handing over of task, and then right the way through to really outsourcing big chunks of your sourcing model.
I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting that you point out the importance of being able to reduce the complexity, right? And to lean into third-party providers who have the expertise and can have really the depth, right, of excellence in a particular task that may be difficult to do in-house and very costly. So you end up spending more money doing it and not doing it as well. And I think that a lot of companies have been hesitant to do that. They prefer to keep everything all internal. And yes, it is a leap of faith, but I do hear this concept is starting to gain a little bit of traction. At least people are talking about it. I don't know how many people are actually 100% going with it, but at least people are starting to embrace that idea.
I think so, and I would envisage that only more will happen here because, again, going back to that point around the need for certainly in the world of supermarkets and grocers, the need for the fashion element and the non-food businesses to be value in terms of their profitability supporting the food business. You then automatically drop down to, so how much is this costing me? And I think that cost element and that enhanced opportunity around profitability is going to be the catalyst for driving, I think you used the word leap of faith, for driving that leap of faith, boards, whether that be around CEOs or CFOs, to agitate that activity. Because you're right. I mean, I think it's as part of my experience, it's as part of a cultural element as much as anything in terms of maybe people where they cut their teeth as a buyer many, many years ago. And people, you're right, people like to have that level of control and they like to be able to touch and have their personal influence on all different parts of the process, whether it be around the sign off of the actual product, the sign off of the actual the costings, etc., to all the different technical and design elements. And because of that, you automatically will build cost. So I think the current situation, the as-is situation, I think is going to definitely further provoke in terms of that change agenda. And also, let's be honest here, Jenny, people are going to look on in terms of, you take, as there is, of the supermarkets, when I talked about the circa 7%, so as there is the sixth biggest brand in the UK at 3% in terms of overall sales for clothing. And, you know, against that backdrop, people will be looking on and say, well, actually, if Asda have had that leap of faith and they've now gone completely with a strategic partner such as PDS in terms of outsourced all their activity, and they're the number one, so they can do it. And we know the world of retail, and even more so supermarkets than any other aspect of retail, I think, is that there's an element of following strategy. So people look on, and if somebody does something, then everyone goes, okay, they're doing it, so now we'll do it, type scenario. So I think that will only drive further change.
I think that's really interesting. And you're right, it always takes someone to be the first. Nobody wants to be a pioneer because if it doesn't work out, then they sort of get caught holding the bag, so to speak. So once other people have done it, then it can be justified that, well, other people are doing it, so we should give it a try. Now, I'm just wondering if part of the equation is that you also have to be willing to go with perhaps better quality suppliers who might not be the cheapest. I don't know how that works, but I think that we've had a sort of a legacy, particularly in the apparel industry, of the race to the bottom, of trying to find the cheapest possible suppliers that we can get. That also sometimes has its own costs, right? Not necessarily on the actual price you pay them, but on other things that need to be done to manage that. How do you see that?
Well, so again, it's a great point. And on the supplier side, we know that we often use the 80-20 principle. I think you can still use that all the way through in terms of 20% of the suppliers driving 80% of the growth, revenue, profitability, etc. So concentrating on the 20% and consolidating suppliers, it's happening already. I only would envisage that will happen even more because, again, it supports that whole complexity piece and cost reduction in terms of the overall operation, but also enables you to develop what I would call a true strategic partnerships between the supplier and the retailer brand, which we know is still hard because I think manufacturers and suppliers are notoriously cautious against big brands. So working with big brands, I think there's an element of caution here, or big elements of caution, maybe driven by some historics where fingers have been burnt, etc. in the past. But from my experience, I think people kind of hold back more than they give. And that's potentially on both sides of the supplier and indeed the retailer brand. they go hand in hand in my view, James. So if you are reducing your supply base, therefore your individual suppliers are becoming more important. Your individual suppliers see the relevance of that in terms of the fact that they have then got more business. The relationship takes on a slightly different dynamic. And then I'm being a bit flippant, but they give more and it's vice versa. And I think that is only going to continue in terms of less suppliers, but the suppliers are equally important, or sorry, of greater importance. Less supplier, but greater importance. What goes slightly not necessarily against that, but actually I think is a complementary element of that, and that's around supply chain resilience. So you've got one side of it which you say, well, actually, let's just reduce the number of suppliers. They all become more important. They all become more strategic. Margins are better, and everyone's happy. But what goes against that actually is what we've learned over the last few years in particular is around the need for resilient supply chains. I'm sure we could do a whole call based on supply chain resilience. If you look at, in particular, the number of incidents that have taken place and impacted supply chains over the last few years, it has been significant. Container prices, the COVID element, the canal piece, etc. I mean, I totted up that in the last 4 years, there's been something like 8 major, let's call it incidents, so like 8 major moments in time that have impacted supply chains. Now, I'm sure that was always the case, but it feels like there's more happening more frequently than there used to be before. I don't know. Question is, maybe it isn't. But I think what's definitely out there from a due diligence and strategic robustness perspective is that the businesses are now really trying to understand in terms of, or further understanding in terms of, what does supply chain resilience look like? And that's about everything we've talked about in the past in terms of nearshore, farshore, etc., split sourcing across different countries. So that's kind of, you've got to play them both together, because that's the dynamic that says potentially, therefore, you're going to increase the number of suppliers, which we've already said the size of the prize is actually to have less suppliers that are more important. So there's definitely a balance to be had here.
I think that's a really good point, because there was a move to consolidate everything. And then, as we've been discussing, there's been a move to work more closely with our better suppliers and be able to move more of the tasks to them. But then, as you're pointing out, you end up putting all your eggs in 1 or 2 baskets. And when something goes wrong, you're the loser. It is a conundrum. And I totally agree with you. The last few years have been a little bit chaotic in terms of unexpected things happening. Every time you turn around and you think, okay, this is settled down, some other thing seems to crop up. So you're 100% correct of the need to really build that resiliency into the supply chain. And how do you do it, right?
I agree. And I tell you, just thinking, Jane, one thing that is an important factor in this part of the conversation is around, and I don't think we touched on so far, is around sustainability. So that whole piece of the understanding the supply base, the robustness as a supply chain against the backdrop of sustainability, is only going to grow in profile. And what's interesting, again, if we home back in terms of supermarket fashion in the UK, if anything, I would suggest, looking on, that actually there's been a reduction in sustainability profile, maybe even against the backdrop of customers having a level of higher expectation. And what's interesting is, when I've had the conversations I've been involved in, and when you dig into this, it all comes down to transparency, visibility, and credibility. So there's been quite a lot of change in the UK around enhanced governance and legislation, in particular around sustainability claims. So organisations or retail brands that have gone out and say, all our cotton is fair trade, all this is, we've saved so much on the water production of our denim products, etc. And what's happened in the UK, some of those retailers have actually caught a bit of a cold, because the governance bodies have then said, well, prove it. Show me the data. And some of those organisations have not been able to prove it or show the robustness of data, because we do know, as we talked before, that having that evidence and transparency all the way through your supply chain is hard.
Yes,
and then I think retailers are still in a place where, the processes around data recording, etc., are improving, and really important to understand things like water, etc., and carbon. in terms of reporting. But I think that what's interesting is that I'd almost say, Jenny, it's gone a little bit quiet on sustainability, and I'm not sure that that's certainly from a UK perspective, whether that be in terms of the physicality, in terms of the messages that the customers are seeing in store, or indeed if you browse websites, etc. Again, that's gone a little bit quiet. So I think I'd almost describe it as retailers being a little bit more cautious, but also around making sure that their house is in order before they start shouting about in terms of their credentials. On the sustainability, another point that's very connected to the dynamics of a food grocer selling non-food and fashion is, I would describe it as being more disproportionately important in terms of sustainability, ethical transparency. Because just to share, so if you take a UK food retailer, most of their product is kind of visible, whether it's coming from a farm or a manufacturer of food products, and most of it's probably within maximum a few hundred miles. Most of it will be within a few hundred miles. And then you add in terms of the non-food dynamic, we're talking maybe 6,000-7,000 miles, etc. So it's a few hundred miles versus, so the actual certainty of credibility around sustainable data, and particularly on the ethical side as well, actually is in my view far easier to assert and get to in terms of food, but actually it's harder on non-food. So then if you go back to this dynamic about actually first and foremost Tesco, Sainsbury's, as there are food grocery retailers, so that the risk profile for them of things not being good on non-food actually not only impacts the non-food business and the credibility of, say, George Clothing, which is the Asda brand, or Two Clothing, which is the Sainsbury's brand, the Florence and Fred, the Tesco brand, but actually impacts the overall brand. So I think the sensitivity around and desire for things like ethical transparency actually is disproportionately greater in terms of food retailer that's also selling.
It does, and I think it's a really good point, because you're right. People made a lot of claims. Some of them obviously were what they call greenwashing, but some of them were really sincere, that they felt that this was sustainable. But then it turns out it wasn't actually as sustainable as some of the standards required, and people got burnt. And now people would rather just not touch that. Rather, even if they are sourcing things more sustainably, they don't want to call it out on a label, in which case they could get in trouble for making a claim that maybe is grander than what it actually should be. So you're right, a lot of people have pulled back, and at the same time, the standards for sustainability seem to be getting more and more stringent. And really, in terms of apparel, as you said, because it is sourced from far away, because it has a very complex supply chain, it's very difficult to be able to meet those standards.
I agree, totally agree. And I think, I was having this conversation with a sourcing ex-colleague a few months ago, and I think there is an opportunity to be missed here, because you're absolutely right. People are a little bit concerned about coming out with big, bold statements around the data and credentials of their sustainability aspect. However, we've already talked about engagement and online content. I think the point that's being missed from some of the big retailers and some of the supermarkets on this side is actually the sharing of and storytelling, because actually what you still can do is, I'd say to the listeners, to go and have a look at some of the websites for some of the major brands in the UK. And you'll find it's really hard to find sustainability stuff, inverted commas. It is there. You kind of scroll all the way down to the bottom and there'll be some sustainability reporting from the board. But it's certainly not there at the forefront, maybe because of some of the reasons we've talked about. But actually, wouldn't it be great actually to be able to show and demonstrate some of the on-the-ground things that are happening? So maybe it's a fashion supplier in Pakistan who's doing an amazing job in terms of they were using 500,000 litres of water a day, and now you're only using 200,000 litres of water a day, and you kind of tell the story of what they're doing, because that's not necessarily coming out with a big, bold commitment, i.e. we've saved water, but actually what it is doing is bringing alive to the customers about the things that are happening 6,000-7,000 miles away.
Right.
And I think that's a real shame, because I think maybe tied in with this caution piece, we're not hearing the the great stories. Because when I was looking after sourcing for Sainsbury's Argos, that was one of the big pluses for me. You go into the factory, the manufacturers, the suppliers, and you say, wow, you are doing such an amazing job in terms of certain aspects of environmental and sustainability work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you're right, it's a conundrum of sorts because brands want to be able to share what they're doing. And like you said, there's a story aspect of it as well that can enhance the brand and enhance the overall image. And yet at the same time, nobody wants to be slapped with a lawsuit or
Yeah.
fines or penalties. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this is reconciled. I mean, it's really, I think for a lot of the brands that I speak to, it's very frustrating for them. They're not really sure what to do.
No, yeah, absolutely. For all the reasons we talked about, and I think that in terms of government and government bodies' response around building regulation and legal aspects is changing all the time as well, actually. So you almost need to be constantly on the page to try and understand what the requirement is. And what I would say is we do know is that some of those big commitments from the big brands around their net carbon reporting, for instance, and being net zero, most are probably around about 2030, 2035, saying within our own operation we'll be carbon neutral and have done a great job for the environment. And then the date is pushed out a little bit further, maybe 2040 or whatever, in terms of when all our supply chain will have a level of environmental status. And in order to do that, as we said before, you need to have those relationships, you need to have that trust and honesty, you need to have that data flowing through, because without that, I mean, if you pick a number, how do you get a number that says the total footprint of an organization in terms of carbon, for instance, is thus, unless you've got all that data. And I think that from my experience, I think organizations are still in that data gathering stage. And this is where I think things like technology, digital capability, even down to some of the AI elements, machine learning, I think all this eventually will be a further unlocker or a big unlocker to enable that information to literally flow through and give that level of certainty. But yeah, not there at the moment.
Absolutely. I think people underestimated what it was going to take to reach these goals. The complexity of it, the fact that you fix one thing, it throws some other thing out of kilter. So yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying, that it's going to take a little bit more to be able to get to where people hoped they were going to be by 2025. So especially
yeah.
a couple of weeks left in the year, it may be a bit difficult to achieve. But it'll be interesting to see, like you said, how AI is going to be able to help get all of that data together and analyze it and give people the kind of feedback that they can in some way apply in a way that's practical and actionable.
I agree, totally agree.
Well, Dean, you shared so many interesting things. You always have tremendous perspective on the industry, on all things supply chain related. I really appreciate your taking the time to join us.
Absolute pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation, Jane, as always.
Thank you, and I hope we'll be able to have you back on again soon.
Always. Thank you.